Thank you, Luca. I'm not mute, right? It's a great pleasure, excitement, first of all, to welcome Rossina Kostova from the University of Tarnovo. I've known her for so many years, but and also with memories connected with the family Mangos back then. So it's a very interesting occasion, actually. And it's a very interesting talk as well. I will just briefly introduce her and leave the floor for her lecture. She completed her PhD at Central European University in 2002 with a thesis entitled Monasticism in Bulgaria, 9th to 10th Centuries, Interpreting the Archaeological Evidence. And afterwards, she published extensively on the medieval monasteries, specifically Bulgarian monasteries, but also 10th century monastic graffiti. And the interests include medieval Bulgarian archaeology, Byzantine and monastic archaeology, medieval archaeology of the Balkans as well. So today's topic is the monastery of St John the Forerunner on the island of Sveti Ivan near Sozopol, from the early Byzantine to the medieval era. And she will probably mention, but there's a documentary made by National Geographic, and it's in this YouTube link. If there's anyone interested more on the topic, can go and watch the very interesting documentary. It's a little bit long, so I've just give the link here. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Rossina Kostova and wish you all a very enjoyable lecture. See you later.
Thank you very much, Luca and Serjan. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to join your seminar. As I wrote Serjan when she addressed me with this invitation last year, I'm really impressed by the very splendid manner you're trying, and actually you succeed to promote the Byzantine studies, not only in Turkey, but in a much broader setting. So congratulations for your efforts doing so. And I'm really honored to join such a prominent selection of speakers. And I hope that my talk will be interesting for you. I choose it not only because the monastic archaeology is my field, but because the site is in our common sea, the Black Sea. And I hope the data, the results from our excavations will provoke perhaps possibilities to collaborate more on working and on studying Byzantine heritage in the Black Sea region. And I'm really very touched in a way that this seminar is dedicated to the memory of Professor Mango, because as Serjan said, we both met in Oxford quite long ago, and actually we were welcomed by the family Mango. So this is the life, and I to some extent happy that I can dedicate this lecture to him, because he and Dr. Marlia Mango, excuse me, inspired me to work on monastic archaeology, on not in general sense, but precisely on Byzantine and medieval Balkan monastic archaeology. So now I will share my screen. do you see the presentation?
Yes, 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 yes.
It's okay. Should I put it on a large screen, or it's better to follow the slides as they are now?
Oh, you can put it on full screen. I think
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
should be
Okay.
okay. Yeah, that's brilliant. Works really well.
Okay. Well, I prefer to follow my text just to respect the time framework. So I will follow my text. Of course, I will do some comments on the slides, of course, and I will be open for questions for those who are interested in the topic. The monastery of St John the Forerunner on the island of Sveti Ivan is perhaps the best documented of all the medieval monasteries along the west coast of the Black Sea among historical sources. It occupied the south terrace of the island of Sveti Ivan, broadly translated as the island of St. John, but I will keep the Bulgarian spelling Sveti Ivan. Approximately 1 mile northwest of Sozopol. Sozopol is ancient Apollonia and medieval Sozopolis. And on the slide, you see exactly the location of the monastery on the island. The monastic complex covered an area of 5,000 square meters on a terrace overlooking the Bay of Sozopol. The island itself is mentioned under the name of San Giovanni in Catalonian Portugal, dating to the 14th century, and Agios Ioannis in 16th century Greek copies of a Venetian portolan from the 15th century. The earliest evidence for the monastery dates to the mid-13th century. According to the Byzantine poet Manuel Fils, Michael Glabus Terchaniotis restored and adorned the monastery of Prodromos in 1262 on the island of Nesion after finding it in a wretched state with only 6 monks residing in it during his victorious raid along the coast between Agatopolis, this is modern day Agtopol, and Mesembria, modern day Nesebar. With respect to later events concerning the monastery and recorded in the sources, however, it seems more plausible that the monastery was not restored during that raid, but some 30 years later. More precisely, it may have been restored during the period spent by Michael Glabus in Sozopolis and the region on the order of the Emperor Andronicus II Palaeologos. According to George Pachimeris, by that time, Michael Glabus had visited Cosmas there, who was a native of Sozopolis and a monk living on an island. It seems quite plausible that this was the island where the monastery of the Prodromos was situated, thus falling under the care of the Byzantine dignitary. The same Cosmas later became a patriarch of Constantinople under the name of John XII Cosmas, also as a result of Michael Glabus' recommendation. After leaving the patriarchal see in Constantinople in 1303, Cosmas returned to Sozopolis and most likely retired to the island monastery. 2 Byzantine imperial charters dated to 1363 and 1437, and 10 charters issued by the patriarchal chancellery in Constantinople from 1482 to 1626 confirmed the privileges of the island monastery as a monastery subordinated directly to a patriarch and provide evidence for a considerable monastic and secular property run by the monastic community in Sozopolis and in its vicinity. The monastery survived until 1629, when the monks were moved to the island of Halki near Constantinople in the Sea of Marmara due to the pressure from the Ottoman Turks, who were aware that the island monastery served as a shelter for Cossack pirates. In addition to the well-documented history as an imperial and patriarchal monastery, St John the Forerunner on the island of Sveti Ivan became known for its library and scriptorium. 60 codices from the monastic library are known to have survived, with 40 of these kept in the ecumenical patriarchate on the island of Halki, where they were brought by the expelled monks in 1629. The codices include liturgical books and writings of the church fathers, all of them written in Greek. The earliest manuscripts dated from the 12th to the mid-15th century and had been copied from elsewhere, as evidenced by the scribal notes, while the majority of the books dated from the mid-15th century to the early 17th century had been copied in the scriptorium of the monastery itself. Here on the slide, you see some pages of the manuscripts kept in the ecumenical patriarchate, as well in the Vatican library. The monastery of St. John the Forerunner on the island of Sveti Ivan is one of the rare cases in which written evidence, and you have seen that there is a very rich in content written evidence, matches an actual site. Several archaeological campaigns have established that the earliest church built there was a three-aisle basilica with a three-apse sanctuary. Here on this slide, you see the team excavating the site since 2008. The first campaign took place in the 80s of 20th century. So here is the plan of the most actual plan of the excavated remains. And the first excavations took place here on the site of the basilica. The aisles were divided by means of tile pillars. The basilica was destroyed by fire, the traces of which may be seen on the nave floor. Soon after the destruction, another three-aisle basilica with a single apse sanctuary was built over the remains of the first one. And perhaps you can see the apse of the first basilica, and these are the apses of the second basilica. The analysis of the soil samples taken from the floor levels of the sanctuaries of the two churches show identical elements in their composition, which implies that the time period prior to the construction of the second basilica was no longer than 50-60 years. The relative chronology of the appearance of the two churches may be placed to some time between the 5th and the late 6th century. The later basilica itself had undergone 3 major periods of reconstruction by the first quarter of the 17th century. There is no evidence of a permanent settlement on the island, and it seems likely that the monastic community take care about this basilica. And one of the evidence provided for this hypothesis is this surrounding wall, which we traced very close to the east of the early basilica. The second church in the complex provides an outstanding example of a triconch with a dome supported by pilasters built in the corners of the nave. The side base of the narthex terminated to the east into brick-vaulted semicircular niches and apparently functioned as chapels. So you see the plan of this triconch and the surviving remains. The walls of the nave and the narthex survived to a considerable height of 2 to 3 meters, perfectly demonstrating the building technique of alternating bands of stones and bricks with the use of wooden beams in the wall core. The masonry and the exterior decoration date the construction of the church to the late 13th or early 14th century. No doubt meaning that it served as the main church of the monastery of St John the Forerunner, built during the course of restoration of the monastic site by Michael Glabus Terchaniotis in the late 13th century. The main elements of the monastery unearthed so far are the surrounding wall with its northwestern gate, the cells along this north as well western and eastern sections, and the number of buildings to the south of the churches, among which one can recognize a refectory here, refectory, a kitchen, a luxurious building, perhaps used as kind of residence or audience hall, and a cistern, deep cistern. You see the actual state of this cistern, which perhaps functioned as hagiasma since the early Byzantine period. In fact, we now focused our efforts on this structure, and actually these are the results from our last season in 2020. Thanks to the archaeological excavations we took since 2008, we were also able to identify the scriptorium, and you see the rooms of the scriptorium, actually 3 rooms we have been able to unearth. Along the north wall to the west of the gate. And actually these rooms house the final stage of the book production, in fact, the banding of the codices. And the reason to make such a conclusion are these bronze punches for stamp decoration of leather cover of the books we found on the floor in one of the rooms. The visible remains of the scriptorium, as well as of the buildings mentioned above, belong to the final period of activity in the monastery between the 15th and the first quarter of the 17th centuries. The most recent archaeological excavations have, however, revealed foundations here from the early Byzantine period preceding the latest monastic buildings in the southern part of the monastery. Perhaps the social context is even more interesting than the architectural setting, and the most illustrative archaeological evidence for the social profile of the monastic community and laymen closely related to it is provided by burial structures. Our archaeological campaign revealed some 5-6 years ago, the tombs of 2 young men buried in the western gallery of the medieval church. One of them, according to anthropological analysis, died aged 20-25, quite young, and he was buried with his boots with stirrups and a tiny glass bottle, kind of lacrimarium, in his right hand. The burial place of honor provided to these 2 men indicates that they must have been highly respected by the monks, perhaps as they donated to the monastery after its restoration in the late 13th century. Archaeological excavations in the last 5 years have brought to light one more very valuable evidence as to the function of the monastery prior to the restoration attempted by Michael Glabus Terchaniotis in the second half of the 13th century. These are 2 Byzantine seals. One of them is anonymous and bears the image of St. George and St. Theodore, while the other and you see it on the slide, belonged to one of the greatest imperial monasteries in Constantinople, the monastery of Christ Philanthropus, founded by Empress Irene Ducaina, wife of Alexios I Komnenos, in the early 12th century. Thus, while the anonymous seal can only be relatively dated to the 12th century, the seal of the monastery of Christ Philanthropos is definitely dated to the 12th century, as shown by the other four similar seals known so far. All of them date to the 12th century. Therefore, despite the lack of any written sources and significant archaeological material from the 12th century, the seal of this Constantinopolitan imperial monastery inevitably demonstrates the fact that by that time, the island monastery of St. John the Forerunner was active and well known to the Constantinopolitan monastic correspondent network. Very curious find is this inscription. This is really an expresses evidence for the strong connection of members of imperial family with the monasteries in Sozopol in later centuries, not only in 12. And it is provided by a fragmented marble slab. You see the reconstruction of the slab here. Which was found in the presbyterium of the medieval monastic church. However, and this happened in the 80s of the 20th century, the first archaeological campaign. During our archaeological campaign, however, in other spots in the monastic complex, we found two more pieces of this inscription. As you can see, the rectangular shape is framed by a metrical Greek inscription, paleographically dated to the 14th, 15th century, while the central part is occupied by incised figures of lions. The slab originally covered a tomb or a sarcophagus, as indicated by the inscription. It is an epitaph remembering a certain hierarchic military officer named Andronicus, who was close to the imperial family. According to Johannes Koder, who published the inscription together with Professor Vasil Guzelev, he might be identical with the Megas Stratopedarchus Andronicus Paleologus, later known as the monk Athanasius Paleologus, a nephew of Andronicus II. Athanasius Paleologus founded another monastery in Sozopolis, the monastery of the Holy Apostles, and perhaps his tomb as a founder of the monastery was placed in the church there. Later, perhaps in the 15th century, the tomb slab somehow was moved to the monastery on the island of Sveti Ivan as a spolia and reused as a postament of the outer table in the church there. In the course of the Ottoman invasion after 1453, the monastery was devastated. In 1489, however, Constantinopolitan Patriarch Dionysius charged the hegumenus to restore the monastery. That is the period between the second half of the 15th century and the first quarter of the 17th century, when the buildings along the north and east surrounding walls appeared, as I mentioned above. You see here luxurious bronze and faience vessels. Also, we found faience tiles for wall decoration produced in Iznik and Montelupo, demonstrate the very high standard of lifestyle of the monks by that time. The gold Western European thalers from the late 16th century and first quarter of the 17th century, you see one example here, perhaps indicate incomes from a kind of international trade. According to the historical sources, at least 4 Constantinopolitan patriarchs visited or stayed in the Prodromos monastery on the island. And here I put on the slide the reasons for which they appeared in the monastery. As noted above, the monastery was finally destroyed in 1629, and the monks had to move to the monastery on Halki. They took with them a considerable part of the monastic library, as I commented earlier, as well as icons and sacred vessels. In our days, one can see in the narthex of the Church of the Monastery of the Holy Trinity on Halki some of the icons, such as the icon of the Mother of God, also the icons of Christ Pantocrator and St John the Forerunner, dated to the 14th, 15th centuries. Our excavations, especially those which we took 3 years ago, however, brought to light a very intriguing question as to whether the monastery, the early Byzantine monastery, replaced a temple of Apollo once existed on the island. We managed actually to gather piece by piece evidence for this hypothesis. Hellenistic coins and fragments of Hellenistic pottery have been found in the layers beneath the southern part of the medieval triconch church and the northern part of the 2 early Byzantine basilicas consecutive, as I said, one after the other. And there we managed to attest foundations of a very large building beneath the foundations of the basilica. It seems plausible that these foundations belong to a Hellenistic temple. Why? The large spolia reused in the western wall of the basilica supports such a hypothesis. And moreover, very recently in 2018, in the course of soundings in the medieval church, a marble slab, you see here the fragment, and this is the graphic image, a marble slab bearing a part of a decree of Apollonia Pontica dated to the 3rd century BC was found. It sheds light on the interstate relations of ancient Apollonia with Heraclea Pontica, and in addition provides a very strong evidence for the function of a temple of Apollo on the island, because you know that these decrees usually were placed in front of the temples. But of course, we could raise another argument, not so direct, about our hypothesis that a shrine of Apollo was replaced by the monastery of St. John the Baptist, because we have many examples, not so many, but very significant actually examples of the same replacement in all the territory of early Byzantine and later medieval empire. And even outside the empire, because I can refer to a very famous example, Monte Cassino, the monastery of Monte Cassino, you certainly know, was founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, replacing active by that time shrine of Apollo. It seems that somehow the cult of Apollo and that of Saint John the Baptist were related. One strong deity was replaced by another strong saint, image of saint. However, our excavations provide us a very rare chance to to see much deeper in the history of the early Byzantine monastery and the history of the patron saint of the monastery. Actually, how the monastery and the island adopted finally the name of St. John. In 2010, we made soundings in the sanctuaries of the early Byzantine basilicas, the earliest and the second one. The first of these coincided with the spot where the pillar supporting the mensa sacra, you see it here indicated, in the later basilica once was fixed. Just to clarify, this is the apse of the earliest basilica, this is the apse of the second basilica, and this is the place of the pillar supporting the altar table of the later basilica. After moving the two bricks, the two brick courses to have remained of the pillar at the depth of 20 centimeters from the church floor, we found a reliquary sealed with white mortar inside the casket. After recording the archaeological context and situation on the spot, we carefully transferred the casket with the reliquary from the island to the archaeological museum in Sozopol. 3 days later, and in the presence of a committee assigned by the Ministry of Culture, we opened the tile casket, pulled out the reliquary, and carefully opened it. Inside, we found altogether 9 pieces of bone. The reliquary itself is shaped, as you can see, like a small ancient sarcophagus with a 2-sided sloping movable lid with 4 small acroteria at the corners and the low ellipse-shaped recess in the middle of the ridge. The shape of the reliquary is comparable to a number of marble reliquaries found in Bulgaria, and all of them date back to the 5th, 6th centuries. The following day after the discovery of the marble reliquary, we decided to check whether the outer pillar of the earliest basilica can be placed at the same distance, had been placed at the same distance of 2 meters and 30 centimeters west of its sanctuary apse. In other words, we wanted to find the pillar of the outer table of the earliest basilica. And it was indeed exactly at the same distance as it was for the later basilica. And in this way, we found the initial location of the reliquary style casket. So that was the original place of the casket. Only one tile of this casket remained on the original spot. The other tiles were moved together with the reliquary to the new location, to the new sanctuary. While clearing the layer of small stones, fragmented tiles, and ashes, we found a small stone box with raised recess on the top and full of earth. Here you see, this is actually this small box. That's how it looked like. And we were very happy to discover that the bottom and the 4 sides of the box are inscribed in Greek in a clockwise fashion. The legible sections revealed the name of St. John in genitive, the date of 24th of June, as well as the name of a certain Thomas, thy servant of God, seeking the Lord protection. You see the restored inscription on the slide. From a paleographic point of view, the inscription may be dated to the 4th, 5th centuries. The text implies that a certain Thomas came from somewhere and that this was related to the erection of the outer pillar of the Nativity on the feast of the Nativity of St John the Forerunner. The most logical suggestion is that the small box inscribed with this inscription served as a kind of transport container in which a certain Thomas brought to the island relics believed to belong to St. John the Forerunner to be placed beneath the outer pillar of the church on the date of its consecration. What might have happened to the relics in such a case, since the inscribed container was found to be full of earth? Perhaps the relics were moved to another official reliquary, let's say, with this reliquary potentially the marble one found beneath the outer pillar of the later basilica. Most probably it was the original reliquary designed to keep the holy relics in the first church and therefore arranged within a tile casket. And you saw that we found one of the tiles of this casket on the spot in the sanctuary of the earliest basilica. The date of 24th of June may have referred to the day of the first church consecration, when the reliquary with the relics was laid down beneath the outer table. The simple stone container, however, was not thrown away, but placed alongside the marble one beneath the pillar of the outer table as well in the first basilica. And that's why we found it there, since it was sanctified by storing the holy relics of John the Baptist for a period. So this is our, of course, hypothesis how to explain the appearance of the two reliquaries in our basilica. But of course, archaeology can answer a good number of questions related to relative chronology of the two basilicas, the sequence in which the reliquaries were laid beneath the outer tables, and the relative dates of the reliquaries on the basis of typology and epigraphy. However, archaeology is unable to provide relevant answers to many other important questions, and we therefore challenged ourselves to use scientific research in as many aspects as we were able to access and fund. The scientific research focused on the reliquaries and the relics. The research on the reliquaries was conducted in Bulgaria, and the research of the relics was completed abroad and funded by the National Geographic Society Expeditions Council. So let's see first the results from the research on reliquaries. Several attempts have been made to provide a scientific analysis of the two reliquaries. One such attempt involved the use of ultraviolet and infrared photographs of the reliquaries. Thanks to these photos, it has been established that the lid of the marble reliquary was attached to the body by means of an organic material and had never been opened until the summer of 2010. Chemical and physical analysis of the mortar adhered the lid of the marble reliquary shows that it is of a masonry type at a ratio of 2 portions of lime to 1 of refill. Perhaps the most interesting is the petrologic analysis of the two reliquaries. According to this analysis, the marble reliquary was made out of a bright white transparent marble that may originate from the areas of southern Turkey, perhaps from somewhere from the Aegean Islands. The small stone box was made out of tuff, which demonstrates features very close to this type of volcanic rock in Cappadocia. As previously mentioned, opening the marble reliquary revealed 9 pieces of bone. Due to the personal decision made by the head of our team, Professor Kazimir Pop-Konstantinov, the relics have been given to the church in the person of the Metropolitan Archbishop of the Diocese of Sliven, who administers the churches in Sozopol. The bones themselves have been moved very carefully from the marble reliquary to a temporary wooden reliquary and transferred to the Church of St. George in Sozopol. That was merely a symbolic act, which was, however, followed by a very thorough metrical study and photo documentation of the bones in the Archaeological Museum in Sozopol. The bones at that time were examined also by an anthropologist, whose conclusions may be summarized in the following way. So you see here on the slide the identification of the bones which he made. It is interesting to say that all the pieces of the human bones are coming from the right part of the body. And also it's very important that we have bones from all parts of the body, from the head and from different parts of the torso, and also the hand and the leg. Furthermore, according to the anthropological analysis, all 6 bones belong to a single male individual, which can be identified as an adult. According to their state, it may be concluded that the bones had not been buried in the earth for a long period of time. Upon examinations in the museum, the relics were returned to the temporary wooden reliquary and kept in the local church. Thanks to the interest shown by the National Geographic television channel in August 2010, we were encouraged to attempt radiocarbon dating and DNA tests in labs of our choice, and with financial support from the National Geographic Society. We addressed the scholars noted here on the slide, Professor Thomas Heim of the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Hannes Schroeder and Professor Eske Wierslev of the Center of Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen. They prepared the project for the scientific research, and these are the goals they set up. As you see, as many as possible questions have been raised in this research. The sampling of the relics took place in the church of St. Cyril and St. Methodius in Sozopol in June 2011. This process was featured along with the final stages of laboratory analysis in Oxford and Copenhagen in a documentary which Serjan mentioned at the beginning, produced in 2012. And you see here photos from the process of sampling, actually, in the church. The main results of the scientific research in Oxford and Copenhagen are summarized for the first time in the University of Oxford press release from 15th of June 2012. And as you can see, it's very important that we have very good data, exactly answering our expectations, the early 1st century. Very interesting were also the conclusions made by the team in Copenhagen. About the most important for us was that they confirmed that the 6 human bones belong to one single individual, male individual, and they had some more observations related to eventual origin of this individual. Well, surprisingly enough, it was not the media or propaganda, but scientific research that turned the discovery of the two reliquaries on the island of Sveti Ivan into one of the greatest archaeological sensations of the first decade of 21st century. Actually, I show here only a very small part of the coverage we got by that time of this discovery of various world media. The human relics found in the marble reliquary appeared to be the first alleged relics of John the Baptist found in an archaeological context in a box that remained sealed for 1,500 years. This was also the first time ever that relics believed to have belonged to the body of John the Baptist had been the subject of radiocarbon dating and genetic testing. The results featured matched the biblical story of John the Baptist quite closely, although it could not be proved that the bones really did belong to this highly venerated saint. Nobody actually state this. The fate of the relics and the further research did, however, encounter a number of unexpected challenges. And here are some of the follow-up stories of the great discovery. The first one was very disappointing. 3 years later, while working on the final publication of the scientific research on the relics, Dr. Hannes Schroeder insisted on sequencing all the scholars who had worked with the bones in order to eliminate any doubts in contamination. Unfortunately, it turned out that contamination had occurred. While preparing the present paper, I asked Dr. Schroeder to share and discuss the DNA results, and this is what he pointed out. Unfortunately, according to him, the setting in which the sampling took place, namely the church, probably created the problem with contamination. And the other major problem is that the pieces were really very, very small, and the sampling was very risky for destroying the bones, which we should not allow, of course. But there was also a good news following the discovery of the reliquaries that gave us hope that we could make a further step in reconstructing the earliest history of the monastery on the island of Sveti Ivan. This was the discovery of a vaulted brick tomb tightly attached to the basilica, to the north foundation of the basilica. This is the tomb. The basilica and the tomb were built simultaneously. In fact, the tomb sheltered two deceased, placed along the northern and southern walls of the tomb, respectively. Both were evidently buried in coffins due to the number of nails found. Surprisingly enough, the skeleton of a 3-year-old sheep had been laid over the coffin of the man buried in the southern part of the tomb. This is the skeleton of the sheep, you can see. According to the anthropological analysis, the two skeletons are male. The northern one aged around 50-60 at the time of death, and the southern one aged 45-50 at time of death. In the layer over the tomb, we found a coin of Justinian I, minted in between 538-565, suggesting the terminus ante quem for the construction of the tomb. This has been further confirmed by a radiocarbon dating of the sheep bones to the late 6th, early 7th centuries. The planning of the tomb together with the first basilica indicate that the people buried there must have been very important to the monastic community, such as founders and or leaders of the community. We therefore set samples for AMS radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis in order to analyze the age of the two individuals. The results produced in the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit at the University of Oxford in the spring of 2017 facilitated a further reconstruction of the story of the island relics. Thus, the result of the sample from one of the individuals is consistent with someone alive in the mid-4th century, while the result of the sample of the other body is consistent with someone alive in the mid-6th century. And you see here the diagram for this person from the 6th century. The two individuals must have been prominent members of the monastic community to have been provided with such a burial place, although in different periods of the monastery's development. It seems plausible to suggest that the individual alive in the mid-4th century may have been related to the transfer of the relics to the island of Sveti Ivan, since such a task would not have been accomplished by an ordinary monk. It is also very tempting to believe that he is Thomas, a servant of God noted in the inscription on the tuff box, but this is a speculation, of course. The radiocarbon dating of the other individual and the sheep laid down on the top of him provide a terminus postquem for the functioning of the first church. It seems that it was destroyed by fire at the end of the 6th century, perhaps during the Avar raid towards Constantinople in 586, excuse me. The marble reliquary was transferred along with the tile casket beneath the altar table in the second basilica that was built over the remains of the first one within a short period of time. Only one tile of the original casket, as well as the tuff container, as we have seen, remained in their original spot, sealed by the new floor revetment. In summarizing the research conducted on the reliquaries and relics found some years ago, already 10 years ago, in the monastic basilica on the island of Sveti Ivan, we must admit that although progress has been made, the main questions remain open. These refer to the management and logistics of transferring relics in the Eastern Mediterranean and the way in which the network of patrons, dealers, and finders of relics was organized in the earliest stages of the 4th and 5th centuries. By that time, Sozopol was undoubtedly part of the nearest hinterland of Constantinople, and it is logical to assume that the foundation of the monastery on the largest island along the west coast of the Black Sea may have been supported by the ecclesiastical elite in the Byzantine capital. The fact that the monastery was directly administered by the patriarchate in Constantinople during the Middle Ages might be considered indirect evidence for such a notion. Acquisition of the relics of John the Baptist in the late 4th century would also not have been possible without a hierarchic patronage. From the point of view of typology and fabric, the marble reliquary was most likely manufactured in Constantinople. The relics, or at least the entire set, did not perhaps come to the island in the marble reliquary because it will be too risky and difficult to carry such a big, nice object for such a long way. Some of them may have instead arrived in the plain tuff transporter container, which certainly was not designed in Constantinople. Let us recall that it was made out of tuff, typical for Cappadocia, a region close to Antioch, where the right hand of John the Baptist was kept until the 10th century. Indeed, the most unusual characteristic of the relics found on the island of Sveti Ivan, as I noted above, is the fact that they come from all parts of the body, the head, the chest, the hand, the leg, and it must be noted all from the right part of the body. In the late 4th century, when we believe that the relics were translated to the island, there were no other relics of John the Baptist in Constantinople except for the head. Apparently, the patron and or the finder of the relics in our story knew much more reliable places one could have found precious pieces of bone from the body of the Baptist. Where and how Thomas, addressed in the inscription on the tuff box, acquired all these pieces, we may never know. And if I have to conclude and summarize my lecture, in which I tried to gather all the data we brought to light in the course of our excavations, is that monastic archaeology in the Black Sea region is a very, very prospective field. And it could be a very good example how archaeology could interact with written sources, with history, and with scientific research. This is somehow a bit didactic as a conclusion, directed to the students, mostly to the students, who should consider monastic archaeology as an attractive field of research for their future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rossina. It was sensational and it was unbelievable. And I thought again, Johannes Prodromos never gives up surprising us, even in the 20s. And as you said, it was actually one of the aims of the Byzantium at Ankara to bring interdisciplinary approaches, new perspectives, and it was just a very vivid example. I was thrilled. It was very interesting, and I urge the participants to go and watch the documentary. It's also very enjoyable to see all the faces. So I will open the floor for further questions, comments. Thank you once again, Rossina. Many thanks. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this site and to invite all of you to visit the island when the COVID hysteria finally ended.
Definitely, Luca, we should visit, maybe a small group of students, scholars, who knows, after the global pandemic is over, it's the first spot to visit. Are there any questions or comments? So I'm just checking. There are, yes, congratulations and impressions, first impressions. So it was a fascinating talk. I totally agree with that. And to see all the efforts you have made, the scientific research, the historical sources. So it was wonderful, actually, to see archaeology and also the dating. It was, I just blow my mind, the dating and everything, the details. There's so much to talk about, actually. So are there any questions?
If I just add something as an information for the audience, the results of scientific research of the relics are already published. They were published, they appeared last year in January in the Journal of Archaeological Science. And they are available, I think, online. So they could be found and read in all the necessary details, which of course I skipped here. Unfortunately, indeed, we did not succeed with the DNA test, but still we made an attempt, which was very brave. And of course, what we thought is that perhaps one should not answer all the questions, especially when they are related to something spiritual. We should not be so much how to say ambitious to find all the answers. Something perhaps should stay remain covered. And that was our lesson from the story.
Yes, absolutely right, Rossina. And there's always the mystery
of course
behind all these findings and interpretations, and using a new method, new approach to an old monument. It's fascinating. Is there any other comments, or Luca, do you see that something I'm missing?
No, you're not missing anything. I'm just checking the chat as well, and there is nothing so far. Rossina, just out of curiosity, since the monastery, yes, located on an island, obviously you're working on a much later period and on a completely different field than mine. Do you see any possibility of of having a comparison, in a sense, with other sites across the Black Sea? Because I remember now from my doctoral years that there was a monastery in Amastris on an island off the coast of Amastris. So there is any, relationship between these little islet hosting monasteries, or you don't have any evidence of this, and basically it was all about this monastery?
Thank you for the question, Luca. Actually, we did not make any research looking for comparative examples for other island monasteries. Of course, we have quite enough examples in the Byzantine setting on very big and famous monasteries which were founded on islands. It could be kind of, let's say, an idea for a project to gather at least the island monasteries in the Mediterranean basin, and to see what common and different features they had. Certainly the challenge of the physical setting are one and the same for all of them, because they're isolated. They have to take care much more in a much more difficult way about everyday life in comparison to those on the coast. Very important issue is the problem with the water, the availability of water. So I think many aspects could be brought now, and especially with new tools we have to study, to make interdisciplinary research, to have a kind of comparative picture of this peculiar type of monastic sites, because they were constantly chosen, although difficult to live there, but monks choose them. This is the perfect shelter for monks' life, for monastic life. And of course, certainly there are different stories, different reasons for the appearance of these monasteries as well, based on the historical background. of the area in which they appeared. But we did not search for comparative examples yet. We are now concentrate to finish the excavations and to start to structure the final publication. And in the course of this structuring, I guess we will look for comparative examples.
Thank you, Rossina. Thank you very much. Serjan, there are a couple of questions on the chat.
Really? Yes, I've just recognized. So from Alex, hello. I'm wondering if any of the structures in the monastery could have been a tower. I have in mind a bell tower. Is the first question.
Should I answer immediately or to?
Yeah. Well, I will read the second one as well. Did you find any liturgical objects at the excavations? Maybe cross, censers, etc. So these are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. No, we do not have a structure as a bell tower in the complex. However, there is a lighthouse on the island. It is one could see it on some of the photos I showed, I provided, and also on the photo for the poster you choose, the lighthouse is there. We, however, got archaeological evidence that in the Hellenistic time, there was a lighthouse on the island, not far from the present one. Whether the lighthouse was somehow maintained during the Middle Ages, when the monastery was active, we could not say. But yes, there was a kind of tower, at least in the Hellenistic period, maybe in the early Byzantine period. But we could not say more because our evidence is very fragmentary. We just made the kind of survey, and we are testing the spot, the eventual spot of this ancient lighthouse, but no extensive excavations were made yet. Concerning the liturgical objects, yes, we found one bronze reliquary cross from the 10th, 11th century in our excavations. Not other pieces of utensils, unfortunately, but as I mentioned in the lecture, the monks took everything with them, almost everything with them, when they moved to the island of Halki.
Thank you, Rossina.